Okay. Okay, Erev Tov. Good evening to everybody. Thanks for showing up. I know how busy everybody is these days with Pesach on the way. And of course, like last week, we are going to be talking about a Pesach issue, and specifically, we're talking about the issue of Shabbat Hagadol, this Shabbat. However, in reality, I'm only using this as a way to talk about the Seder, as you'll see in a few minutes. Just before we get to the sheet, I just want to say one or two words about Shabbat Hagadol. It's a question. Why is this called the Great Shabbat? Look, every Shabbat is approximately 25 hours long. So I mean, no Shabbat is bigger than any other Shabbat in that sense. So there are two famous reasons. I'm going to give one now, and one is going to be on the sheet in just a minute in the name of the Levush. But the one I want to mention that I find fascinating, and I think is the real reason that traditionally we call this Shabbat Hagadol, is if you remember the mitzvah of Sfirat HaOmer, it says that you should start to count mimacharat HaShabbat. And everybody agrees over there that the Shabbat that it's talking about is Chag. And so we see that we can refer to Chag, to holidays, as a Shabbat, because it's also a lishbot, to have a cessation of work. But what we're trying to say is the real Shabbat of every seventh day is greater than the Shabbat of a Chag. And the reason for that is technical. This is not so pleasant, but I'll say it quickly. The reason for it is not so pleasant, but it is that if, God forbid, in the days when we had Jewish courts, real Jewish courts. I'm not talking. This is not about. I'm not going to talk about judicial reform. In the good old days when we had real Jewish courts, a Sanhedrin, it was theoretically possible to execute someone for transgressing Shabbat. Shabbat, according to the Torah, we believe it almost never happened, but theoretically, you could be executed for transgressing, for chilul, for nullifying and profaning Shabbat. However, if someone breaks Chag publicly and blatantly, under those also bad circumstances, that person is not executed. That person gets lashes. So we're saying that the Shabbat of the seventh day of the week is the greater Shabbat than the Shabbat, which is a Chag. So even though we work very hard preparing and getting ready for holidays, and they don't come so often, and we really look forward to them, ultimately we're trying to tell you that Shabbat of every week is even greater. Because think about it, when we celebrate Pesach, we're celebrating the great miracle of HaKadosh Baruch Hu bringing the Jews out of Egypt. It's so wonderful and so moving. But when you think about what Shabbat is celebrating, a greater miracle, the creation of the universe, is even more magnificent than the wonders that the Jews experienced while being redeemed from Egypt. So Shabbat is great because we're saying that Yom HaShvi'i is greater halachically and conceptually than Chag, as much as we love Chag. Okay, so that's Shabbat Hagadol. But there's a custom. At the top of the page, it's in Hebrew, I'll translate very quickly. The Ramah, Reb Moshe Isserles, in his commentary on the Code of Jewish Law, giving Minhag Ashkenaz, the European Jews' customs, said, V'haminhag loma b'mincha, on the mincha time. So right after you daven mincha, there's a minhag to do what? Loma Haggadah, to recite the Haggadah. Many people do this. Matchila avadim hayinu. You begin, you don't ask the 4 questions. You start with avadim hayinu, and you go all the way till lechaper avonatenu, until the line that says to atone for all of our sins, which is the end of Dayenu. So in other words, the minhag is to read from avadim hayinu just till you get to Rabban Gamliel, who talks about those 3 visual aids. And since we don't have the visual aids in front of us, we don't read that. We stop right after Dayenu. I wonder if anybody sings Dayenu on Shabbat Hagadol. But anyways, the minhag is to read all of that stuff. Okay, that's the normative minhag. However, like every good Jewish minhag, there's another team who says, no, don't do that. And so the other team is headed, the captain of the other team is the Vilna Gaon, and he's a powerful heavyweight in Jewish tradition. But just before we do that, I apologize. I want to do the Lavush. Well, he's the second opinion over why this Shabbat is called Shabbat Hagadol. I almost skipped it. Lefi sheba Shabbat Hagadol hayatabo hatchalat hagu'ula. The beginning of the redemption was on the Shabbat that we call Shabbat Hagadol. What happened? V'nisim be'eit nitzir b'tzrayim shulakhu et aseh lekorban Pesach. It was apparently, according to the Lavush, the calendar, the year of the Exodus was like this year's calendar. The Torah says at the beginning of chapter 12 of Shemot, of Exodus, that on the 10th day of the month, you have to take a lamb. So the 10th day of the month of Aviv, which we call Nisan, they called the first month, was Shabbat. And they sacrificed it on the 14th, which was Wednesday. And then they had Wednesday night, they had the Seder, that's the 15th. So that's the calendar breakup like we have it this year. So that it's called the Great Shabbat because the Jews followed God's instructions, took this animal, which was worshipped by the Egyptians, and put it out on their front lawn, so to speak. They tied it near the house someplace, and they said, hey, we're going to sacrifice this in a few days. What do you Egyptians think of that? In other words, the Jews were finally displaying the kind of independence that their freedom was to augment. So that's why it is Shabbat Hagadol according to the Lavush. Okay, here we go. But then the Vilna Gaon says that you shouldn't follow this custom. You shouldn't read the Haggadah on Shabbat Hagadol. Why not? Okay, the Vilna Gaon. One shouldn't read the Haggadah before Pesach because you're not supposed to read the Haggadah before Pesach. Why not? This idea comes from a close reading of the text because in the Haggadah, right after the 4 sons, it says, and you should tell your child on that day, it says, Yachol me Rosh Chodesh. Maybe you could recite the Haggadah starting on Rosh Chodesh. And then it says, no, by Yom Hahu, you're supposed to do it on the day when you've got these visual aids in front of you. And you should tell your child on that day, that means not before the 15th when you have the Seder. And the Haggadah explains the phrase, Ba'vozeh, because of this, refers to the specific objects on the Seder plate. You're going to point to this and that and the other thing. You're going to point to the bitter herbs. You're going to point to the matzah. And in the good old days when we had the temple, you would have pointed to the lamb, the Paschal lamb. So you point to things. It's visual aids. And those things that's when you start to read the Haggadah. So we're not supposed to read the Haggadah until then. So don't read the Haggadah, the Shabbos, according to the Vilna Gaon. Okay. Therefore, one shouldn't read the Haggadah before Pesach when the matzah and the maror aren't in front of you. If you're not in front of you, you shouldn't read the Haggadah. However, this doesn't prohibit study. And we're going to return back to this idea in about, I'm going to say 10 minutes. We're going to come back to this idea. Just because you maybe shouldn't recite the Haggadah on Shabbat Hagadol, nevertheless, that doesn't mean you shouldn't be preparing the stuff for your Seder. Everybody should be preparing things to say at your Seder. And if any of you don't lead your own Seder, speak to the person who's leading a Seder and say, I want to chime in with something. And everybody should have something to say at the Seder. It's a joint educational activity, and everybody should want to contribute in some way. I mean, it depends how many people are there. I'm going to be leading a Seder of 34 people. I'm not going to encourage everybody to give it to Torah. But if when the setting is smaller, I do try to encourage people. Okay. So it is right and fitting for every God-fearing Jew, that's us, to study the Haggadah with commentaries. By the way, every year there is no book ever written with more commentaries than the Haggadah. There are more commentaries on the Haggadah than there are on the Bible. I know that's hard to believe. Someone did a count, and this was a couple of years ago, and every year new ones comes out. It was over 5,000 commentaries printed and available on the Haggadah. It's amazing. It's absolutely amazing. Almost every rabbi, I shouldn't say every, I didn't do one. Almost every rabbi has written a commentary on the Haggadah, and many of them are fabulous, and a large percentage of them are available in English. And so whether whatever, preparations you want to do, it'd be, so depending upon, the situation at your Seder, be wonderful for everybody to contribute something. However, one should be careful not to recite the material aloud. In other words, I can sit at my table and I can study the Haggadah, but I shouldn't read it out loud. Mitchila of the Avodah Zarah Hayovaten. I shouldn't do that. I have to do it quietly to myself, because if you read it out loud, then it's as if you're actually doing the Haggadah. Okay, so there's another point made by the Baruch She'amah that I didn't put on the sheet. I was going to. It says it's on the sheet. It's on the sheet. The Baruch She'amah, which is Rabbi Baruch Halevi Epstein, also called the Torah T'mima, he said that if someone reads the entire, out loud, recites the entire Haggadah before Pesach, they're yotzeh, they've already done their obligation. That since the miracle started on Rosh Chodesh, if you recite the Haggadah any time from Rosh Chodesh on, according to Rabbi Epstein, you have fulfilled your obligation and you don't have to do a Seder, and you shouldn't even say the blessing over the Seder at the end of the recitation. I don't know if anybody else really paskins that lahalacha, but it's just an interesting position. So even if you are studying Haggadah, don't recite it out loud. Okay. The Chasidei Karlin, it wasn't only the Vilna Gaon, it was also the Hasidim. One should not read the Haggadah before Pesach. Why not? Just as one shouldn't eat matzah before the holiday, in order that the taste be beloved in your mouth. So I guess the Karlina Hasidim had tasty matzah and tasty seders. So so we see that it was even though it's a big custom to recite it this Shabbat, not everybody agrees. But we started talking about you have to have visual aids for the Seder. That teaches us something else. So let's take a look at the Chizkuni. Ba'avor zeh asa Hashem li. Because of this, pointing finger, this matzah, this maror, that korban, we don't have the korban Pesach, but hopefully soon we'll have it again. According to Rashi, this is a hint to the answer to be given to the son, which is called the Rasha, the evil son. Why? Rashi means that this is the answer to be given to the wicked son, who does not even bother to ask what is special about these days. And especially on the first night, the word li, this is what Hashem, li, for me. And that's what the father says to the wicked son, and not for someone like him, that bad son, would make it, this is a suitable answer for the wicked son described in the Haggadah as reacting to all the rituals he observes with a derisive, why are you going to all this trouble? What is all this bother? The word li implies that if he had been there, God most certainly would not have bothered either with redeeming him or any of the miracles leading up to it. Now, I happen not to like this comment. I'm going to tell you in a second why I put it in. First of all, I don't think that any of us really have Rishaim, evil people around in our families and at our Seder. I think that the idea of the Rasha is more theoretical, rather than actual. And then we say what Hashem did for me to exclude him. I think that means that theoretically there could exist such people. And I think in every generation, and I think at your own Seder, it's a worthy discussion. Who in our generation do we consider to be the irredeemable Jew? Who is the Rasha that we would exclude? And I'm going to guess very strongly that at your actual Seder, there will not be such a person, Be'ezrat Hashem. And then in your families, we basically don't have such people. But it's a worthy discussion of who we would theoretically exclude. And there are some wonderful historic Haggadot that have pictures of the four sons. And I always find it fascinating to see in different centuries and in different generations who they considered to be a Rasha. And the sad reality for most of the time when we've had printed Haggadot from like the 15th century till like the 19th century, almost always the Rasha was portrayed as a soldier, because one of the sad realities, whether in Central Europe or Eastern Europe, Russia, Germany, in many, many countries, when a child was drafted into the army, they stopped being Jewish. They were lost to us. So the Rasha in many of these Haggadot is shown, with a sword and with a shield. I have to open this chat. Just thought of this, but kids and teens don't like being left out, so sometimes it's a motivation. Oh, for sure. Yeah. For sure, you should ask everybody to say they should try to say something. I agree, yeah. But I think it's a good question. Who today is a Rasha is a great question for discussion.
No, Rabbi Walk?
Yes.
Rabbi Walk, my question is that by saying, if you were there at that time, you would not have gone out. I'm saying that's like saying to the kid, you would have been left out. And sometimes that's the motivation.
Yeah, I know. I know that's said in the Haggadah, and the Midrash says it. I don't believe that Midrash for a second. Again, I think sometimes Chazal were like, and this was very common in pre-modern education, to establish boogeymen. You know what I mean? And in France, in the late Middle Ages, the boogeyman was a stepmother. That's why the evil person in many, many children's stories is a stepmother. But the idea of having a boogeyman and saying, oh, this person is excluded was a tactic that was used in education that I really don't like. But I didn't teach in the Middle Ages. I taught in the 20th and 21st centuries. I was very big always on inclusion, not exclusion. However, throughout much of educational history, exclusion was considered to be a major weapon in in your arsenal of how to how to convince children, quite coerce children to follow, to follow what you want. Don't exclude anybody. It just said to include everyone. But I think the discussion of who in each generation is a Russia is fascinating. One of the interesting things, if I can just say one, I mean, every generation has to do it. In 1920, there was a famous Haggadah that was printed in New York, and the Russia was a prize fighter, because between the wars, between World War I and World War II, a lot of Jews in America went into prize fighting. There were champions. Benny Leonard was a champion, middleweight champion, Jewish, and the rabbis thought that if somebody became a boxer, he's no longer Jewish. And athletes in general, this was true until Hank Greenberg didn't play baseball in a World Series on Yom Kippur. Then all of a sudden, all the rabbis liked Jewish athletes. But until 1938, I believe that was, when in the late 1930s, becoming an athlete was considered so that was the Russia, in the 1920s. So, and every generation, there's a famous Haggadah right after the war, after World War II, that showed somebody, holding a deck of cards, gambling, some people, So I think every generation should discuss who we would consider to be. Someone showing a picture of a soldier. Yeah, historically, soldiers were the bad guys. It's true. It's just a fascinating discussion that, as an idea. Okay. I want to go to the bottom of the page, because we're going a little slowly. If we have time, I'm going to come back to the Malbim, but we'll see. The Or HaChaim talks about the two expressions that are used in the mitzvah to teach and recite the Haggadah, and it says V'higadata. V'higadata leven bayom hahu lemor ba'avozeh. So you've got the expression V'higadata instead of V'amarta. Why do we start with V'higadata and then only afterwards say V'amarta? What's the difference between lahagid and lomar? So Or HaChaim starts off by saying it's unusual. The Haggadah understands the verse as referring to a time when matzah and bitter herbs are in front of you. That's what we talked about. The mitzvah should be done with the visual aids of matzah and maror, which means the night of the Seder. We have to understand this in accordance with the statement that when one recites the Passover story, one begins with aspects which reflect discredit and concludes with aspects which reflect credit on the Jewish people. In other words, the Jewish people started off in a bad place, and we went through all sorts of stages of development, and then we became the Jewish people. And we went from not so good or even bad to wonderful. And we think that we love this idea of transformation. Everybody, it's a very romantic idea, going from a caterpillar to a butterfly. Everybody, it's a wonderful idea. And we believe it's true of the Jewish people as well. So we start off with the word v'higadata, which is harsh. You've got to tell them. And then afterwards, va'amira, you just say it. So we start with relatively harsh material and move to relatively soft, sweeter material. So how do we begin? The discredit consists of the fact that our ancestors were pagans. Avram Avinu came from a family of pagans, something one can hardly boast about. The Torah therefore hints at this procedure by writing the Haggadah. You begin with a harsher description, starting with more difficult facts and realities. You will relate matters which are as tough as tendons, which are very difficult to swallow and difficult to deal with. You will conclude with Amira, words which recall that you were, I don't know, I should have changed that, are meritorious, because we've moved away from those negative roots and we become meritorious. So we start with tough material and we move to much more pleasant material. Okay. The Torah, now the Torah is Rabbi Yaakov ben Arush, and Rav Yaakov ben Arush wrote the original format of the Shulchan Aruch. He's the one that invented that it had 4 sections to it and named them. He gave us the basic outline of the Code of Jewish Law, which later got put into its present format 200 years later by Rabbi Yosef Karo. But Rabbi Yaakov ben Arush, living in Provence, southern France, during the time of the Black Plague, it wasn't an easy period. So he also wrote commentaries, not just halacha. And he commented on the Haggadah. On account of this, the Lord has done for me when I left Egypt. So we saw a few minutes ago that someone was emphasizing, it was Chizkuni, was emphasizing that excludes the other person. The Torah is looking at it in a much more beautiful way. And he's saying this verse is Israel's justification to future generations for performing the rites of gratitude on the annual celebration of Passover, and why all Jew generations are duty-bound to continue this tradition. The reason why the Torah uses the pronoun zeh, this is it, this is the matzah, this is the maror, same thing, just like then, is that you are to tell these experiences of yours to your children now. Now, I take this line to mean 2 different things. Number one, and I think this is the more logical pshat, but I think the second thing I'm going to say in a minute is just as important. We should be able to tell our children something about what happened to us when we were kids at our Seder. In other words, if I can do that, I am connecting my children to the Exodus. Because when I was a little kid, I went to a Seder with someone who heard from generations before him, who heard from generations before him, who heard from all the way back, so that it's a unbroken chain back to Egypt. So the first point is, I tell what I heard from the generations before us. Rabbi Soloveitchik makes a big point. That's how we daven. Dor ledor yishabach masecha, generation to generation, praises your deeds. I know how to daven because I saw the generations before me daven. And now I have to display that kind of behavior for the new generations. And the same thing is true at the Seder. That's what he means. It's a very beautiful idea. However, someone once tried to figure out that if everybody goes to a Seder with a grandparent, it's only 20 steps all the way back to leaving Egypt. Because it's, if everybody has then there are like, 4 generations at every Seder. If it connects back in only 20 steps back to I don't know how the math worked out, but okay. I think that it means something else. I think, and I can't do it so much this year because I'm going to be leading a communal Seder. But when you're doing a family Seder, I think it's not only important to tell your kids what you heard when you were a kid and make that part of the reality of the chain of tradition. I think you should just also let your kids know why these Jewish customs are important to you. I think a good Seder includes the older generations sharing with the younger generations why this stuff is so meaningful to us. I think that's very important. I think it's not enough that that your grandchildren know, oh, Bubby and Zadie do X, Y, and Z. I think it's also important that they know why we do X, Y, and Z. And I think that every year it just slip in a couple of personal things about, oh, I love this custom because I remember when my Zadie did this, and I love the meal because my Bubby did that. I think these things are very important. This is not exactly what the Torah is saying, but it fits in with the fact that the Seder should be a time of cross-generational pollination. This is what we really want to do, and as much as we can. I mean, you have to, you can't spend the whole Seder doing this. You pick the moments, and every year try to share another vignette, one here and one there. And I think it's very important. I've appreciated being at Sederim where this has happened. Especially with me saying it. No, I meant even when other people did it. Okay. In other words, you who have experienced this. Now, the this here means the Exodus, but the this can mean anything in Jewish tradition. You who have experienced things they haven't experienced have to tell your children what happened on that day when they had not yet been born. Ibn Ezra understands the words of Ba'avozeh because of this to mean that God performed all these miracles in order for me to annually commemorate them by the performance of the rites legislated here. That it's my job to use my annual, bully pulpit or my annual soapbox of the Seder to really let my kids know, the things that happened to me, and just share with them, what makes certain, not just the Seder customs, but Jewish customs in general important to you. I think that I think it's important that, and then you'll be amazed that the kids open up about things too. Either to let you know that something's important to them, or they'll say, this one doesn't really speak to me. And you can tell them that's okay. That's what should happen at the Seder. More than anything else, there should be this cross-generational, I called it pollination, right? We pollinate the next generation. I think it's very important that we keep those lines of communication open in a very, very, non-judgmental way, and really share, and hopefully you can find things just to open different types of discussion. The next comment by Rev Bondi. Now I got to be honest, I don't know much about Rev Bondi, and I just saw the comment. I just found it fascinating, so I figured I would share it. Rev Bondi's name was Rev Shmuel Bondi. He was born in 1794 and he died in 1877. And he was the rabbi in Mainz, in Western Germany. Okay, now Mainz was a famous Jewish community, and it got wiped out. So when he was in Mainz in the 19th century, it was a totally different group of Jews. There were centuries in which there were no Jews in Mainz. The community in Mainz, the present community in Mainz, well, his community mates. There is no present community mates. Okay, Holocaust got rid of that. But the 19th century community mates had only started in the 1500s. So it was only 300 years old approximately. Okay, so he was one of those rabbis like Shimshon Raphael Hirsch, who felt that they had to fight against the Haskalah, the Enlightenment, the Reform movement in Germany. And he made an interesting comment. I just found it interesting. I'm not. You can accept it or reject it. It's just interesting. The 4 children are not children at all, according to Rabbi Bondi. They are 4 types of rabbis addressing their congregations. Each begins his sermon with a prayer, Baruch HaMakom, blessed is the omnipresent, and each delivers his message. Each one belongs to a different kat, that's Hebrew word for a group. Each one belongs to a different category. A kat is like a team or an intellectual position. It doesn't take a lot of imagination to realize that Rabbi Bondi is speaking about orthodoxy, reform, the nascent conservative movement, and the 4th speaker, which was apparently a common phenomenon in Germany, and I didn't realize it, is not a rabbi, but a well-educated person who assumes leadership based on general knowledge rather than Jewish knowledge, that there were Jewish communities where the head of the Jewish community would be like a professor or a doctor, and they were very wonderful people, but their interests for the community were less religious and more social, and the Jewish communities in Germany were very well organized, and they paid taxes to the government, and the government actually supported rabbis and cantors and synagogues. But in some communities, the government supported the head of the Judenrat, of the Jewish group, and he wasn't always a rabbi. So he considered that like really horrible, with that Jewish communities existed, official Jewish communities recognized by the German government without a rabbi. Regarding the child who doesn't know how to ask, there are matters that need explanation. The language used to describe this child is different from the other 3. Instead of saying, you shall say to him, the Haggadah says, at pitachlo, you should open up for him. Interesting, open up for him. The Haggadah suggests that one should answer him directly, him or her directly. You should open up. One should tell this child about the suffering in Egypt and how God saved the Jewish people, so that he or she will give thanks for the kindness which God performed. In this way, the child who doesn't know how to ask will be inspired with compassion. When I was a kid, a lot of rabbis were involved with like fire and brimstone. And if you don't do what you're told, bad things happen, and and iron horrors and all sorts of. I don't think that that's what we want to do. I think that the Rabbi Bondi, writing almost 200 years ago, had the idea, which is we have to impress upon the kids that Torah is Torah Chesed. Torah is love and compassion. And in this way, the child doesn't know how to ask, be inspired with compassion about what happened to his own parents. In other words, if you personalize it enough, this happened to me. This is why I do this. Then it means more to the kid. And quite often, parents don't explain why they do things. And the Seder is a great opportunity to correct that lacuna in the knowledge of our children. The word vihigadata, you should tell, implies that one should tell the story in a way that draws his heart closer. So we saw a few minutes ago, the word vihigadata means to do it a little bit harshly. Here it's saying vihigadata, you make it into a story. You make it interesting and exciting, right? That's vihigadata, as opposed to just, oh, this is what happened. No, you say, wow, it was amazing. This happened and that happened. Vihigadata comes for a term not for saying things over in a forceful way, but for saying things over in a dramatic way. And and it's a story, and you're developing it, and that can have a tremendous impact as well. The Torah doubles the fork of this language per se, v'higadata lemor. You should tell the whole story and make it interesting and make it funny and sad. Get in all the emotions that a good story has. The first word implies the drawing of the child's heart close to the Torah. The second implies doing it in a soft manner. So I have to be dramatic, and I have to be interesting, and I have to be informative, but I also have to be kind and sweet and encouraging, as best you can. Okay, I sort of skipped something on the previous page because I saw the time was zipping along, but I just want to return to the idea. In the Seder, we go out of a way to mention that there are two different mitzvot concerning leaving Egypt. There is a mitzvah of Zecher Yetziat Mitzrayim, and every day, morning and night, we say Shema. And in the Shema ends with I had to sit here. Where did I just put it? Oh, sorry about that. I had it open and I closed it on myself. Okay. And we say at the end, Lama'an tizkaru v'asitim et kol mitzvotai, you wear your tzitzis to remind you, v'item kedoshim le'elokechem, and you stay holy to the Lord your God. Ani Hashem Elokechem, I'm the Lord your God. Asher hotzeiti etchem me'eretz Mitzrayim, I am the Lord your God who took you out from the land of Egypt, Liot lachem le'elokim, to be for you a God. Ani Hashem Elokechem, I am the Lord your God. So in other words, that fulfills a mitzvah of every day just mentioning lahazkir, you'd see it Mitzrayim. Just got to mention it. At the Seder, that's not enough. That's what we do every day. Just mention, oh, by the way, we came out of Egypt, and we're supposed to do it every day and every night, okay? But at the Seder night, we have a special mitzvah of sipur, of telling the story. Telling the story is what we've been talking about. And we've been talking about, oh, you do it kindly, and you do it forcefully, and you do it excitingly and interestingly. But the Rav, and this is the last piece on the back of the page, talks about 5 differences between the mitzvah of just mentioning and remembering that we were exiled, that we came out of the Egyptian exile by God redeeming us, and the mitzvah that has to be done at the Seder, which is not to mention it, but to describe it, expand upon it. And so all the things we've been talking about is to perform that second version of the mitzvah, which is unique to the Seder night. So the Rav wants you to know that there are 5 differences between what happens on a regular Wednesday night and what's going to happen next Wednesday night. Okay, and here it is. Sipur Yitzit Mitzrayim is a mitzvah of Talmud Torah. Telling the story is a mitzvah of Torah study. Now, what I just said, just reading that verse, that's not Torah study. That's just mentioning a verse. I didn't explain it, but at the Seder, we're supposed to really be learning, studying Torah together, and an act of Masorah. For the Rav, the idea of Masorah was very powerful. Masorah means transmission of the Torah to the next generation. My job is to make sure that the next generation takes my Torah and imbibes it to the point that they make it their own so they can pass it on. So Masorah, to be a link in this chain that goes back to Har Sinai and to Egypt, that's what I want to make sure that I am forging the next link in the chain. That's the Masorah, okay? This idea is accentuated by a passage which has a resemblance to Birchat Torah. Baruch HaMakom, Baruch Hu, Baruch Shenatan Torah L'Amo Yisrael. So since before we tell the story, we say what's almost a bracha on Torah study, it's a hint that what's going on here is Torah study. And therefore it demands this kind of introduction. Asher Natan et the Torah, right? To gave us the Torah. There are 5 distinctions between Zechirat and Sipur Yetziat Mitzrayim, between the mentioning and the relating of the Exodus. Number 1. First, Sipur consists of discussing Yetziat Mitzrayim in detail, whereas mere reference to Yetziat Mitzrayim suffices for Zechira. I said, I just read to you, God took us out. That's all I'm Yotze. But at the Seder night, I have to talk about how God did it. There has to be details. There has to be description of the process and how long it took and the 10 plagues and all of that, okay? So number 1, simple. Mitzvah A, simple. Mitzvah B, you've got to elaborate. Number 2, second, Zechira does not require Hallel. Sipur does. When I say tonight, before I go to bed, right? Wow, God, thank you for taking me out of Egypt. That's it. But at the Seder night, I've got to sing. Hodu Lashem Kitov, Ki Li'olam Chasdo. I have to praise God. Part of telling the story is evoking this reaction. Wow, thank you, God. Hodu Lashem Kitov, Ki Li'olam Chasdo. I have to praise God and thank God for the action. Number 3, Sipur means a total and all-encompassing experience. In other words, part of the telling is eating, drinking, reclining, visual aids, looking at things, touching things, breaking things. In other words, all of the Sipur requires me to get animated in doing these things. There was one year when I was teaching afternoon Hebrew school 20 odd years ago, and I actually got a local factory guy to give me these 50-pound burlap bags that we use. They were burlap bags for 50 pounds of potatoes. And we cut out heads and arms, and the kids began the Seder wearing them. And then we said, Avadim hayinu lefar v'anu b'nei chorin, the kids took it off. And they would, were no longer dressed like slaves. I mean, to come up with things like that, so that you're doing something. It's action, hopefully. The fourth distinction is based on the fact that the Rambam refers to Sipur Yetziat Mitzrayim only in terms of the miracles which occurred in Egypt proper, but not those that occurred at the parting of the sea. In addition, the Rambam's Haggadah does not include the reference to the number of blows suffered by the Egyptian at the sea. Sipur Yetziat Mitzrayim, though, aims to recall and relive the drama of Yetziat Mitzrayim only, and thus there is no need to mention Kriyat Yamsuf. So, in other words, according to the Rambam, and the Rav agrees, he doesn't do that whole business that Rabbi Akiva said, and Rabbi Yishmael said there were thousands of miracles. He doesn't, at the sea, because we don't have to talk about the sea. We are focusing on one event in Jewish history. Now, we also talk about the ramifications, the hashlachot, the fallout from that event and how it's affected all of Jewish history, but it's all based on that one event, and I don't have to, and I may even cloud the issue by bringing in other miraculous events. Okay, that depends on your custom. I actually skip those paragraphs. Right after Pesach Hadash Ba'achav, right after we have the abbreviation of the 10 plagues, I go straight to Dayenu, and I skip all of that stuff that talks about what happened at Yam Suf. If you want to read that, read it on the seventh day of Pesach, which is the anniversary of that miracle. But I don't say it at my Seder. It was not in the Haggadah of the Rambam. Okay, the fifth and last of the distinctions is that Sipur Yitzim Mitzrayim cannot be this is an important one, cannot be a restatement of what everybody already knows. Since Sipur Yitzim Mitzrayim is characterized by Talmud Torah, Sipur entails innovating, broadening, and deepening its essence yet further each and every year. It's very important. Now, I mentioned this earlier, you can go and buy a new Haggadah. You can go on a YouTube station and listen to somebody tell stories, but you should find something new to present at your Seder every year. Find a new shtick. It's very important. It's very important that that everybody feels that and you feel that you've done something that's new and innovative and different. And Baruch Hashem, there's so much material, either online or by buying a new Haggadah. It's so easy to come up with brand new stuff, brand new material to present to the people at your Seder, so that every year our retelling of a 3,300-year-old event is brand new. That's the trick. You're talking about something very, very ancient, but every year it requires to be involved with brand new ways of expressing it, of understanding it, and more than anything else, brand new ways of expressing how it affects me. And if you do a good enough job of telling the people how it affects you, it will affect them, because that's what we want. That's what we want. Okay, again, I just want to remind you that we will not have a class next week. Blined, I'll send out, I'll write something up and send that to you then in place of the class. But I want to thank everyone for coming this evening, and I hope everyone has, Chag HaShiva Sameach, a Zisen Pesach, but hopefully more than anything else, a meaningful Seder in which you really find a meeting of the minds and a meeting of the spirit of everybody that's around your table at your Seder. Thank you so much for joining.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Chag HaShiva Sameach. A wonderful, wonderful Chag. Bye-bye.